Hello, everyone. I'm Alex of Consulting Group A, and my team and I are going to go over why some of these countries would or would not be a good fit for Turner Scientific. So, first is the kind of country profile of Brazil. It is the sixth largest country in the world, located in South America on the eastern side. The economy is a free market economy that follows capitalist guidelines, and their population is 209 million people, which is the fifth largest in the world. Their government is a federal presidential republic who is led by President Jair Bolsonaro at the moment. Federal presidential republic just means that it is led by, it's governed by elected representatives. The GDP is just over $2 trillion. Their GDP per capita is just under 10,000. And their ease of doing business score or rank is 109 out of 190 countries, which is actually the best rank they've had in 10 plus years. It generally spans from being up to 129th down to about 110. So this is the best they've been in quite a while. Some strengths are their growing healthcare, IT, medical device services industry. This is good, means that Brazil is taking a stronger stance on just providing better healthcare to the people of Brazil, as well as kind of testing what's going to work, this on animals to see what will work. And this is a very big market for Turner. The labor force is approximately 104 million people, which is the fifth largest in the world. And having such a large labor force, if these people can get employed and start making money, that means that companies in Brazil are making money. And if these 104 million people are making money and putting it back into the economy, the economy is going to pick up and start to thrive. Brazil also has a handful of resources to help foreign companies succeed when entering the market. They range from just getting around the entry barriers to helping companies win contracts with the government, to even kind of helping companies against unfair trade practices. Some reforms that they have are to help with trading across borders. Since Brazil is bordered by 10 other countries, Turner Scientific could be doing a lot of business across the borders. And so the reform has made it easier to kind of do compliance and all the other necessary legal documents to kind of get that done a little quicker and electronically. And then they've improved the contract and patent law. So they have introduced new mediation law that really just backs up the contract and patent, making sure that both sides are doing what they said and aren't really screwing each other over. Some weaknesses is kind of the economy. The GDP is pretty good at $2 trillion, but their GDP per capita is pretty low for how large their GDP is. So that suggests that there's a lot of poverty. And this poverty really takes place around the major cities, on the outskirts, in the slums. The corruption, they were ranked 105th out of 175 countries. And a large part of this corruption is most notably Dilma Rousseff, who got caught up in a bribing scheme and was later impeached. And this goes along with the unstable politics. They've had 3 presidents in the last 5 years, which, when talking about the highest elected office position of a country and there's a high turnover rate, it's not really a good look and doesn't really instill a lot of faith in the politics of that country. Brazil also has an unemployment rate average of 12% over the last 3 years, which you don't want to see with such a large labor force. You'd like to see a lot more of those people in the working force, and that's going to pick up the economy a lot. High corporate taxes. Brazil has a 13% higher corporate tax than the U.S. Brazil's corporate tax is 34%, but one little good part about this is they did get rid of taxes on check transactions. And then another weakness is the strong stance on animal rights research. And I'll go over this a little more on the next slide. So as a team, we kind of decided that Brazil was the least optimal choice for Turner Scientific to get into. They do have the reforms that help businesses succeed and the resources to help navigate the market when first entering. Then the strong stance on animal rights in research, it's kind of good and bad. It could be good if Brazil keeps their animal testing but heightens up their guidelines, and Turner can come in and help labs really stay on track and make sure that they're meeting these specific guidelines. But it could also be bad because they could just completely get rid of research and testing on animals, and that would really drastically limit the Turner Scientific market. So Brazil has the worst ease of business ranking among the 5 countries we were given. So Brazil, Russia, South Korea, China, and India. Their poor infrastructure. They use highways a lot for freight, which is inefficient. There are a lot of unpaved roads, and there's also a lot of areas that are just now getting electricity. So they're very far behind in infrastructure for kind of where they are economically. And then unstable politics, like I mentioned before, 3 presidents in the last 5 years. It doesn't really scream out, we got this, or we're like a stable nation. And then the roller coaster economy. They are coming off of a really big recession, and they've been doing really well as of late, but we don't know how long this prosperous moment is going to last. And we don't know how big of a drop they'll take if this moment kind of comes to an end soon. And then to talk about India, MJ will take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm MJ, and for this project, I had the pleasure of looking at India. And so through my part of the presentation, I'm going to take you through the strengths and weaknesses of looking at India as a country for Turner Scientific to enter. All right, so first off, I just want to kind of give a little bit of information about the profile of India and the market analysis. So as I started to research India, first of all, it should be noted that it's a stable democracy. And I looked at some of the scores, and the composite economic freedom score was 55.2, which gave them a ranking of 129 out of 186 countries. The population of India is over 1.3 billion, which equals to the 2nd largest in the world. we'll talk later about kind of how that impacts the analysis. I think the population is a huge strength and makes India a very intriguing market. Next was the ease of doing business score is 67.23, which puts them at a world rank of 77th. Those scores are all kind of important to look at when looking to emerge into a country, because you're trying to figure out if it's a good fit and how the ease of doing business for a foreign company, what that looks like. We'll talk a little bit more about the details of that later on in a couple of my slides. So the GDP for India is at 9.5 trillion. It has a 6.7 growth and a 7.2% 5-year compound annual growth. I want to note also, before I move on, jumping back to population with 1.3 billion, a huge chunk of that population within India lives at the poverty level. So I think that's just important to kind of touch base on as we're looking at the total picture of India's profile. So next up, I looked at the institutional and business regulatory environment of India, and I've just listed briefly some strengths and some concerns. So regarding strengths, the first one, there's a commitment to the health sector. So what the heck does that mean? In India, the government has provided, the World Bank has, over the last 2 decades, stated that there's been several bank projects that focus on improving quality health services in the public sector. So the infection rate for individuals in India has gone down, and the number of individuals with HIV has gone down. So why that doesn't necessarily directly correlate with Turner Scientific's products, I think it's important to recognize that there is a commitment to improving the health sector. And what I would come to the conclusion, or I guess would hope, that there's a commitment to the health sector in the public sector that would translate to the medical research industry, which would correlate with what Turner Scientific is trying to break into over in India. It's important to note that there's 159 institutes funded by the central government, and I found that there's over 450 research institutions. Also, I wanted to throw out a couple more numbers. There are over 100 medical journals published in India, and I found 177 contract research organizations. So all those kind of at least allude to me that there is a desire to improve the health sector all the way into the medical research industry. So some concerns I had regarding analyzing India were the financial freedom and navigating regulations. So what does financial freedom mean? I thought this was fascinating. As I was researching India, the fiscal health was a relatively low score for the country. And what I found is that, much like the United States, there's states, within the country. Well, there's states within India, and these states are overspending, right? So then they depend on the government to come in and bail them out, right? So these states are relying on government aid and tax revenue to function, which means that the government does not have a lot of excess funds. All the excess funds are going to help these states and bail them out, which these funds then normally would be put towards investing in future growth and investments and infrastructure. So that's not happening because the government is trying to help the states out by bailing them out. So that was like a huge red flag to me, that a definite concern that there's kind of this mentality of just trying to help states, and there's this debt mentality that we're just going to try and cover our bases but not really invest in infrastructure. So that kind of couples down into navigating regulations, because with not a whole lot of excess money or funds to put towards infrastructure within the country, navigating regulations for a foreign entity can be really frustrating. There's not a lot of people at the application process for business. There's not a lot of inspectors. There's just lack of funds and individuals when you're trying to start a business in India, it's just not very easy. So moving on, is looking at key market intermediaries and institutional voids. Again, I list pretty briefly the strengths and concerns. There are trade shows. There's 46 upcoming agriculture trade shows in India. Now, those might not be specific to Turner Scientific needs, but it would get their foot in the door and allow a space for them to network and navigate through getting into that country. So I think they kind of have to be a little bit willing to invest in relationship building in the country of India. So there is one trade show that brings in between 20 and 50,000 people, which I thought was a worthwhile trade show to look into. The ease of shipping, what that means is that there was 12 major and 200 notified minor ports within India, and as well as FedEx does exist. They have 16 clearance facilities. So that just means, I think, moving within the country would be available. The workforce, again, that's kind of coupled with the population, and I'm going to touch base, followed up with the growing middle class. With the workforce, with having 1.3 billion people, that's a pretty hefty workforce. So they can pull from, companies can pull from that workforce. I would view that as a very big strength. Again, that population is so big that that's a huge strength for India. Regarding the growing middle class, this was remarkable. So in 2009, there was 50 million people in India that were classified as middle class. 50 million, okay? Remember that number, because it's going to go up to, they're projected to have 475 million people in the growing middle class by 2030. So they're going to go from 50 million all the way up to 475 million people that are considered in the growing middle class. So that, to me, that's a huge strength. Those numbers are remarkable. And you're going to have people that, what does that translate to? Growing middle class, people that have more disposable income, more people in the workforce. When more people have disposable income, they spend more money in the economy grows. So I just think that's kind of a broad picture of how that can impact them. But I think that's just a huge strength for India. Regarding concerns, I list two, but they're two pretty big ones. One is improper conditions in laboratories. The second is animal rights stance in medical research facilities. So if we go back, improper conditions in laboratories, right now, India is supposed to be following the Prevention of Cruelty to Animal Act of 1970, but they continue to get these, and all the articles I researched and read on India regarding this subject, they continue to get poor marks in just about everything for their laboratories. So that is a concern, but I also see it as a major opportunity for companies like Turner Scientific. So India is getting poor marks in poor environment in their research laboratories, poor practices, and poor scientific procedures. So they continue to have like no air conditioning in their research facilities. They continue to not have proper water for their animals. They typically don't have full-time veterinarians or full-time lab managers. So to me, this is an education piece that Turner Scientific can come in, and if they can talk to people and talk to the people that run the labs and kind of stress the importance of integrity within research testing, I think they could make a market for themselves. There are no competitors right now, simply because I think there's just not a huge push for integrity within animal research laboratories. So overall, and I've gone kind of quickly through all this, but the strengths of emerging into India, again, that growing population, that 1.3 billion people, emerging class. Remember, we talked about going from 50 million people in the middle class all the way up to 475 by 2030 in the middle class. Those are just huge numbers of people. The growing healthcare sector. Again, we talked about the importance that the government is investing in improving their healthcare sector. That hasn't quite carried over to the research part, but I see that as a major opportunity for companies like Turner Scientific. However, there are concerns with emerging into India, and those concerns outweigh the strengths. So again, kind of summarizing all of it, the government spending, the monetary freedom limitations, those states within India are overspending, which is causing the government to come in and bail them out, which doesn't mean there's a whole lot of money left over for infrastructure and investment into future growth, right? That's a huge red flag, especially as businesses are evaluating all these different emerging markets. Without that money to invest in infrastructure and future growth, there's a lack of infrastructure in India. And there's also challenging regulations that all kind of couples together with how the money is being spent at the government level within India. And then another huge concern is our animal rights within India. And again, the standards in which their laboratories, their medical research laboratories are operating are a huge concern, right? The laboratories themselves are not very, they're not filled with integrity testing. Their environment is poor. And regarding the animal rights side of it, it seems almost non-existent in India. So that's a concern. Also a huge opportunity for somebody like Turner Scientific to come in. It's going to be a lot of education piece for them, talking to locals and lab operators as far as the need for integrity within testing and why it's important to have animal rights procedures in medical research. So with that, I think India is an intriguing country because of that growing population and that booming middle class. However, you can see the concerns outweigh the strengths. So you'll find that as we kind of go through our presentation, there are countries that present a more favorable environment for Turner Scientific to enter. And with that said, the next person that is going to speak is Kaitlyn, and she was able to analyze China, and she will go next. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaitlyn Schwarz, and my research today is on the country of China. With the population size of approximately 1.4 billion citizens, China is the largest country by population in the world. Interesting enough, the US and China are similar in land size, however, the population is 4 times as large in China. The government is controlled by a Communist Party, with the head of the government being Premier Li Keqiang, and the head of state is President Xi Jinping. The capital is Beijing, which is actually the 3rd largest city in the world. And the gross domestic product for China is $12.2 trillion, which makes it the 2nd largest GDP in the world, trailing the United States by about 7 trillion. And the average annual growth over the past 20 years for GDP is approximately 9.2%, which we'll dig into a little on the next slide. The Chinese market strengths, again, bringing up that GDP annual growth figures, over the past 3 years has been about 7% annually. And in the graph below is the GDP annual growth rate over the last 20 years, Chinese growth being shown in blue and the United States in red. As you can see, since about 2008, the annual growth for China has been trending down, so it will be interesting to see where that goes in the future. Specifically for Turner Scientific in the medical research industry, the next 5-year annual growth is expected to grow by about 9.2%. Also, the last market strength is that hospitals in China prefer high quality research materials, which is an advantage for a foreign company like Turner Scientific. Currently, Chinese companies provide low cost, low quality materials, which hospitals in China do not prefer. Moving on to Chinese market weaknesses is first the import of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. Over the past 20 years, this has averaged at about 26%, which is actually very high. However, when we look at the graph down below, again, China being in the blue, we can see that the imports are slowly starting to decrease, which is not an advantage for a foreign company like Turner, because we want their imports in China to be high. This is mainly due to a couple reasons, the first being the increased trade tensions between the US and China. China has applied approximately $110 billion on tariffs for US imports alone. The second being the Made in China 2025 initiative. This is a government-run initiative which aims to reduce the dependency on foreign technology. In 2015, China actually established this initiative, and they're trying to build up technology in China and to support Chinese companies, not foreign companies. To summarize, China is the second largest GDP in the world with an annual growth rate of about 9.2%. However, this is trending down. The 2019 Economic Freedom Score is 58.4 out of 100. So this makes it the 100th freest country in the world, mainly due to a low score for property rights, which is not ideal for Turner Scientific. Also, the government-controlled initiatives such as Made in China 2025 are providing advances for Chinese companies, not foreign US companies like Turner Scientific. Next, we will explore the market of Russia with Korrine. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Korrine Croft. I will be covering Russia and why Turner Scientific should or should not be expanding into Russia's market. Just a little quick overview of Russia's country profile. The world's largest country by landmass. Their capital is Moscow, which is the 11th largest city in the world, and their population size is the 9th largest in the world. Russia's GDP. Russia went through an economic recession in 2015, but since by 2017 had risen again 1.5%, giving it the world ranking of 173rd. GDP, their sum of importing and exporting comes to be 46.7% of their overall GDP. This is the 20th world rank, or 20th largest in the world. They import and export with China far more than any other country, but actually the United States is the third largest importer to Russia. This does include medical technology and pharmaceuticals, as stated in the healthcare system, but their healthcare system was ranked last by the Bloomberg report out of 55 developed countries. They do, again, rely heavily on imported medical devices, and it's an anticipated $160 billion to be invested into the healthcare system throughout the next 6 years. This was put in place by Vladimir Putin, and it's called the Russian Strategy for Development of Medical Science, which was improved until 2025. And their trade freedom score came to be 77.8. The institutional and business regulatory environment, their ease of doing business score is 77.37. This gave them a world ranking of 31st. One thing to keep in mind was a weakness of theirs was trading across borders. Their economic freedom score was 58.9. This gave them a world ranking of 98, which furthermore, this was below the global and regional average for Russia, but it had increased 0.7 between 2016 and 2017. Their rule of law score is below average. Property rights, they're very weak in Russia. This earned them 52.4. The rule of law is very, well, it's not known to be maintained. This earned them a 45.1, and corruption is high in Russia in regards to government, so this gave government integrity a 36.6. These were all far below when you compare to the United States. So one also has to keep that in mind, but again, this is an emerging market. In regards to institutional voids, specifically in regards to animal research conferences, there's nothing that particularly pertained to Turner Scientific, but there are 60 trade shows scheduled in Russia dedicated to medical technology and pharmaceuticals. This means that Turner Scientific could go and network, get their name out there, see what's out there. A lot of these are held in Moscow, and a lot of the healthcare system and laboratories, research centers, they all generally tend to lie in Moscow. In regards to animal rights, they follow the Universal Declaration on Animal Welfare. This is the anti-cruelty provisions and the penal code. It's very general. There's no other existing policies or legislations protecting animals from being used in scientific research. Again, it's very, very basic. And it was stated that if there were additional provisions, they would likely not be followed from a judicial point of view. The banking system in Russia is very limited, but it's led to an evolution. They do not tend to meet capital and credit needs, but it's generally dominated by large state-owned banks. Actually, 5 of them own or control over 50% of the assets in Russia. These also obtain sanctions limiting access to U.S. financial markets, but there are U.S. banks that are working in Russia. It's just that those banks cannot create or expand into new branches throughout Russia. Some of these include Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and JP Morgan. Shipping FedEx is available. There's a customs tab, even when you look up on FedEx, how to and ship to and from Russia. So Turner Scientific would be able to use that. Their workforce is the 6th largest globally. It includes more than 76.5 million people. But their unemployments are ranked 77th globally. And then protecting intellectual property. The main thing here is one has to be proactive. They remain on the special 301 priority watch list in 2018 regarding protecting intellectual property. And really, what I want to emphasize is that the US does not obtain the capability of enforcing private rights on Russia. Thus, companies, individuals, you have to protect yourself, you have to be proactive, you have to take those steps necessary to protect yourself. And there are legal counselors. There's the Russian Federal Customs Services IP register. There's multiple things in place. You just have to research, know your research, know where to go, how to do so in order to protect yourself. To summarize Russia, the biggest thing is that if you want to move and expand into Russia, it's really going to be a long-term gain. So it's going to take a lot of investments on the front end to see gain long-term. We as a group decided that Russia was better than other countries, but still not our best shot. They obtain a low GDP growth rate ranking, an average trade freedom score, a higher ease of doing business score than Brazil, India, and China, which aided in putting those behind Russia. And they also Russia also obtains a higher economic freedom score than these countries. Thus, we still, again, have not ranked it as our top choice, but again, it was in front of Brazil, India, and China. The healthcare system is corrupt, but there is a current and futuristic focus for improvement, and it relies heavily on the importation of medical devices, which is huge for Turner Scientific. The institutional voids, just to summarize, it's not heavily restrictive by animal rights. FedEx is available. U.S. banks are established, just cannot be expanded. And there is a large workforce available, both unemployed and employed. Just again, really to emphasize, we place this behind South Korea because there is opportunity, but there's also huge risk. So while it's, again, we as a group chose to place this higher than Brazil, India, and China, it still is not as less of a risk than South Korea, which Eric will be discussing in our next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Korrine. Today, I'll be talking about South Korea and why we believe that this may be the most beneficial option for Turner Scientific to explore. As an overview, South Korea is located in Eastern Asia on the Korean Peninsula. They have a population of over 51 million people, over 10 million people in the capital city of Seoul, including 25 million people in the greater Seoul region. Now, over 70% of the country is considered to be mountainous, which is one of the reasons why the other 30% is so densely populated. Today, South Korea is run under a presidential republic under the leadership of President Moon. In the early 1900s, South Korea was a very agricultural-based society with very little international trade or international exposure. Today, it is almost the complete opposite. They have one of the world's most highly educated labor forces. They place a high emphasis on education, which has taken the country from mass illiteracy to a major international technological powerhouse. Today, their GDP count is over 1.5 trillion US dollars, and they're quickly closing in on $2 trillion annually. Over the past 15 years, they've also averaged an annual growth rate of 3.6% within their GDP. As mentioned, South Korea was a very agricultural-based society with little trade exposure and little international exposure. I mentioned that this has changed greatly because today they are a very trade-reliant economy with over 80% of their GDP coming from international trade. With this, some of their main trade partners include the United States and China, which account for over 25% of their international trade. Part of the reason why they were able to advance from an agricultural-based society to a technological powerhouse is because of the government support and funding. Today, the government continues to support and fund the different areas within research and development. In most recent years, they placed a high emphasis on technology, biotechnology, as well as the medical field. South Korea has over 14 government-funded research institutions, and there are also 21 contract research organizations within South Korea. Now, this may seem like a smaller number compared to some of the larger countries, but when you take account the size and population of South Korea, this does account for a great portion of the world's research. Within these 35 organizations and institutions, there are over 3 million animals used annually in medical research. They project that this will continue to increase at a rate of 250,000 animals per year. As well, with this research and these animals used, over 90% are of the rodent population. When we talk about South Korea, we want to keep in mind how easy it might be to do business there. According to the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, South Korea had a score of 84.14, which put them as the number 5 ranking country in the world. This is even above the United States, which came at number 8 in the world. Some of the strengths according to this index include getting electricity and enforcing contracts. This can be a key benefit to Turner Scientific if they look to enter South Korea, as will give them that peace of mind knowing that their contracts will be enforced. As well, it will be a good start to building those business relationships needed. One of the biggest weaknesses for South Korea was getting credit. Now, although this was the greatest weakness for South Korea, they are still well above the world average for high-income nations. As well, we had the economic freedom score of a 72.3, which ranks South Korea as the 29th highest country in the world, and they are well above the global average and regional average as well. Something else that we looked at was a rule of law score, which again, South Korea came in above average. One of the key areas we want to focus on is property rights, as well as intellectual property rights within the country. The Korean government has placed an emphasis in recent years on building international trade and building international relationships. One of the ways to go about this is through an emphasis on intellectual property and the protection of these rights. They have enforced strict guidelines as well as harsh punishments for anyone breaking the rule or breaking these laws. Overall, there are some strengths and some concerns that we have for South Korea. Well, some of the greatest strengths include a growing emphasis on research and development. Again, the government has placed an emphasis on the research and development of the country, which has assisted them with becoming one of the more technologically advanced countries, and they are continuing to grow at a rapid pace. With this, the government has also supported scientific endeavors financially, which has played a key role within this. Although they are one of the highest funded countries as far as research and development, the government has plans to continue to increase the government funding of these scientific endeavors, which again include biotechnology as well as the medical technology fields. Something else we want to look at is a steady increase in animal testing, as well as the regulations involved in animal testing. Not only has the number of the animals increased, but there are also people pushing to increase how ethical the testing is, as well as the environments that the animals are kept in. This can be a key benefit for Turner Scientific, as not only will it help with the research studies, but it can also be viewed as a way to keep the animals in an ethical way. Again, touching on intellectual property rights, the government has placed a key emphasis on protecting these rights in hopes of increasing international trade and international relations. Some of the concerns that we had for South Korea include the lack of political transparency. It is important to keep in mind that although the judicial system is independent and efficient, it is not free from political pressures. Many times the regulations will be less transparent and allow for differing interpretations by government leaders. And there can also be pressure on international businesses to match local firms in pricing when directly competing with domestic businesses. For a company such as Turner Scientific, though, this can actually be a benefit because there are no known direct competitors for their products within South Korea. Another concern that we have is the increased concern and attention on animal testing. In recent years, there have been multiple organizations that have tried to put a stop to animal testing and animal research for some industries, including cosmetics. Something else that they've pointed out is the duplication of recent studies. Previously, there were studies done, and currently they have found that there are studies done duplicating previous research projects, and this is not to include or add any benefit to the original study, but it is more so just to increase the numbers of their research projects for these research institutions. So this is one of the concerns that we have, as there may be some regulations passed in the future that can limit some different studies done regarding animals. Another concern that we have is the commitment needed for the business relationships within South Korea. In South Korea, business relationships and contracts are viewed as only the beginning of their long-term relationship. South Koreans, they look for not only trust, commitment, but also integrity. When beginning a relationship in South Korea, they place a key emphasis on long-term commitment, and they shy away from short-term deals. Again, these are some of the strengths and concerns that we have for South Korea, but overall, we believe that the strengths outweigh the concerns that we have, and that is why we are recommending South Korea to be Turner Scientific's next business endeavor. Thank you.
To conclude, we believe that Turner Scientific has the best opportunity for the emerging market of South Korea, followed by Russia, China, fourth being India, and then Brazil. We chose South Korea based on a high ease of doing business score, as well as high economic freedom score, and their emphasis on property rights. And again, we thank you for letting you research our company, and we look forward to any feedback that you might have. Thanks.